This episode is proudly supported by Fine Food Australia. It's only a few weeks until Fine Food Australia, the country's leading trade event for food service and hospitality, is back on in Sydney. As a professional in the food industry, you know the importance of staying ahead, discovering new trends, connecting with suppliers, and finding the inspiration to move your business forward. For over 40 years, Fine Food Australia has been the ultimate destination for chefs, restaurateurs, cafe owners, food retailers, and distributors alike. With over 900 exhibitors across 12 product categories, featuring both local and global brands, Fine Food Australia is where you'll find what's next, what's new, and what's driving the food industry forward. Make sure you register online before the 8th of September to secure free trade entry, so you don't have to pay $45 at the door. Don't miss Fine Food Australia on from the 8th to the 11th of September at ICC Sydney Darling Harbour. For more information, go to www.finefoodaustralia.com.au.
I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Kaurna people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging.
We should be celebrating this. The belief in the industry and its place in the hierarchy of quality. As a proud winemaker in Australia, that's something that I'm banging the drum on all the time and trying to get people to understand.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Christopher Carpenter is the winemaker at Hickinbotham Clarendon Vineyard. Residing in California, he is also the man behind the wines at Cardinale, Lokoya, Jota, and Mount Brave. It's safe to say that he is a very busy man, and I'm thrilled that he's carved out some time to join me whilst he's in Sydney today. Good morning, Chris. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Shanteh. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad that we've turned on the sunshine on this beautiful day for you.
It was unbelievable. I was in Sydney yesterday, and it was like a spring day. It was just perfect. I heard that the last week, it hadn't been that kind of weather.
No, you're right. It has been a bit gloomy around here, but I think we're all coming alive after that gorgeous kind of sunshine's shining, and we feel like we're drying out a little bit. Now, you were born in Boston and you grew up in Cary, Illinois. I'd like to know, did you grow up in a family of kind of wine drinkers? What was on your table as you grew up in as a young man? No,
wine wasn't a part of our dining or in any part of our life, and no alcohol was really. My parents, not that they were teetotalers, but it wasn't part of their world. So my interest in alcoholic beverages started when I started working in bars in university. And that's where I started getting a fascination for the process and the beverage and everything else. It was post-family, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, work behind a bar, going through university, it sounds familiar. And spirits are such a big deal in the States. What was kind of your first drink that you actually enjoyed drinking? Do you remember?
Wow. Back in those days when I was in college, there was a very popular cocktail called the Long Island iced tea. And it's just a horrid drink. But in the early years of my alcohol consumption, alcohol was a means to drop some pretenses with my personality. And the Long Island iced tea helped to do that to a very great degree.
It doesn't surprise me. And it's full of sugar. It's full of fruity drinks and then a mixed concoction, but it certainly does the job. So it doesn't surprise me that was a drink of choice. And then tell me a little bit, from bartending, you then kind of worked at an Italian restaurant. Tell me about the moment that kind of wine came across, your life and your first reactions to it.
Well, I've been bartending at university and then in Chicago. And then when I moved out to California to pursue winemaking, I worked at a place called Trevino, which is the Italian restaurant that you're referring to. And that was just a continuation of my evolution as a restaurant person and as a bartender. The first aha moment with my wine exploration was an Italian restaurant back in Chicago, and that was as a customer, not as a server. I palled around with people in the restaurant industry in Chicago, and we would go to each other's place of work, and we had a mutually beneficial relationship with all of our colleagues that were servers and bartenders. And this Italian place that we went to was on the area of Chicago called Little Italy. And this place is a classic, red and white checkerboard tablecloths, not very ostentatious, good Italian soul food, if you will, not fancy. And we would go in there and have the sausage and peppers and the shells and broccoli and big salads, and we'd always order the basket wine of Chianti. And our friend who worked there was a server, and he was about 3 or 4 years ahead of us in wine knowledge. And, we were working at some pretty renowned restaurants and bars in Chicago, and we had a lot of money back then in form of cash. This was back in the 90s when cash was king. So we had a lot of expendable income. And he's like, you guys shouldn't be drinking this basket Chianti. You're at a point in your learning about food and wine where you should start thinking about better wines. And he said, to that end, I brought in this bottle that I wanted to share with y'all. And it was a bottle of the 1990 Groth Reserve Cabernet from Napa. And, that particular vintage was an outstanding vintage, and that particular wine had been highly rated, which we didn't know because we weren't following the Spectator or any of the critique organizations that were out there at the time, which back then was really just the Spectator and Robert Parker. But he turned us onto this wine, and it was one of those epiphany moments where, as soon as it hit my palate, I was like, oh my God, I had no idea that wine could be like this. And from there, his name was Jay. We started utilizing Jay as a resource. We would then go to one of our local bottle shops that was a very great resource for wines in the Chicago area. And I became friends with a couple of the clerks there, and they started turning me on. And that was that bottle was the spark and the momentum of my evolution as a wine person, if you will.
I love that because when you think about a lot of things in life, when you have a hobby or you have a passion for something, a lot of it is, collector's items or things you want to take home and put in a room. And wine is just so the opposite of that. It's all about sharing and that collective enjoyment. And so, thanks to Jay for wanting to bring that wine in and show you, as opposed to drinking it by himself and he's lonesome at home. It's just, that's what wine's all about, isn't it?
Yeah, it's funny because I reflect back on that, and to think that he brought this bottle in that probably was not very easy for him to get his hands on. The place that he worked at didn't have that kind of selection. It had the basket Chianti and 3 other wines on its red wine list. So he brought that in, and his boss allowed him to serve it to us. And then, again, being such a renowned wine in Chicago from California at a time when that wasn't such a thing, it was a real privilege. And I've lost touch with Jay over the years, and I often wonder where he is with with wine in general, and if he thinks back like, I shouldn't have given those guys that bottle because that was a really good bottle. I'm sure he didn't, because he was not that kind of guy. But anyway.
I'm sure he does it. And it's funny that you've mentioned that, because I often think about the people I like drinking wine with the most. And it's often not people that are very aware of brands and how much bottles cost, but it's people that show enthusiasm and are happy to engage in information about wine when they don't know as much, and just enjoy the whole process of it. And so I certainly think as a sommelier, it's wonderful to bring over wines that people don't know what they should expect from it or how much it is or, what the reputation is. And they just taste it and have their honest opinion. So I can kind of see where, he would have wanted that drive to just give you guys something that was pretty special and get you off the fiasco of Chianti that you were drinking.
Yeah. And it's funny because, what you just said, I had a similar conversation yesterday with somebody that I was working with, and we were talking about their movement into wine, and they're fairly young wine person, and we were reflecting on the kind of people that we like to turn our wines on to, and the intellectual side of wine can somewhat be intimidating and often keeps people away from it. Mm-hmm. And we chatted about that, and I ultimately, for me, what I want to see is that experience of joy that comes across somebody's face when they're tasting the wine, and just liking it because it sets off all those emotions or those memories or that moment of discovery, versus trying to break it down into the side of wine that we can all geek out on if we choose to, the science side or the regional side and down to the village or whatever, what level of detail you want to get into. But ultimately, it's about just enjoyment and creating another level of experience, hopefully in a dining environment, if not in just a casual social environment. Mm-hmm. I think that's the most important thing that we often lose touch with.
Yeah, I totally agree. What are we doing here if it's not to bring joy to people at a table, around with special people that, we enjoy their company? At the end of the day, it's kind of basic. So we do get a little, out of touch, Tom, and you're exactly right. I want to know a little bit about kind of your career journey. You studied biology, and then went on to study viticulture. I want to know a little bit about kind of the process of how you kind of came to those degrees and moved into your first job.
Yeah, well, I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana to pursue this degree in biology. It was actually a pre-med, and I was always a science geek, and that there was never any doubt that I was going to study in the sciences. But what I didn't know was what I was going to do with that degree. And my family, like many families in medicine, had a number of our family members that had pursued medical careers. So I thought that was the path that I should pursue. My grandfather was a doc, my grandma was a head nurse, my mom was a nurse, and so on and so on. And I realized, particularly because of an anatomy class and me didn't get along, that wasn't why I was in the sciences. The pursuit of medicine wasn't for me. For a number of reasons that I went through the discovery process on it. It was more about the natural world that I was interested in biology. But by the time that I made that realization, I was far into the degree, and I had to finish it up and move on. Well, as I mentioned, I got my way through college partly by working at a campus bar. So when I had this incredible degree and not a lot of prospects as to what to do with it, because I wasn't going on to further education, I moved up to Chicago, about 3 hours north of Champaign, and got a job in a bar. And the bar that I worked at was open till 5 a.m. So a lot of the people that were coming in there from 11 on that I became really close with were people getting off of work from restaurants. And we were their watering hole. We were a bar. I mean, we had good bar food and such, but being open till that hour of the night, you're not having dinner at 3 a.m. So that group of people and I started discovering food and wine in Chicago. Meanwhile, I've got a job in blood and urine analyzers. I was selling to hospital laboratories, and I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to settle down. I wasn't ready to work in an office all the time. And it forced me to think about what I was doing in my life. I knew that I wanted to stay connected to the restaurant industry. I knew that I wanted to get back into applied science. I was utilizing some of my degree because what we were selling with these analyzers was disease state management for physicians. And then I had left the Irish bar that I was working at, and I was working at a music club on the north side of Chicago. And it was one of those places that attracted a lot of creative types, whether they were artists or actors or musicians or such. And that energy really was compelling. And I wanted to tap into that somehow. So I didn't know how to put all this stuff together, and I was running out of time. I was getting to, I was almost 30. I was being asked to make a decision towards my career in medical products. So I took a walkabout. I went out to California. I had mates that lived up and down the coast. I couch surfed. I went to the beach. I went to coffee shops and read and drank and partied and, all the things that you do. And I was trying to figure out where I was going. And one of the last places I landed was Napa. And in Napa, I started putting all the pieces together as I was going from tasting room to tasting room, as I was going into restaurants, talking with the restaurant people who I had an affiliation with because of what I did back in Chicago. I could speak their language. I made the connection between these three things that I was looking to do. The industry, the wine industry has a great connection to the restaurant industry. They're symbiotic. So I'm in and out of restaurants all the time, as a winemaker. I utilize anywhere from 8 to 20 different forms of or fields within the sciences to grow the plants and to produce the wine. And it's creative. There's an aspect of my year where I shut down my analytical and I move to the creative side of my brain. And those things, were all that I was looking for. I got back to Chicago. An article in a food magazine that I had subscribed to talked about a program at UC Davis that trained winemakers in the science of winemaking and to a lesser degree how to make wine, because wine is a craft to a degree, and you need to work for people to learn how to actually make it. But this was an accredited program at one of the great university systems in the U.S. And knowing what age I was at, I needed to get the leg up, if you will, and I applied and got accepted and moved out to California from there.
Wow. I mean, when you said you were running out of time, I kind of laughed at that. But then you did say you were 30, and I'm thinking of like a 22-year-old. So 30 is a little bit later in life, especially for how much you've achieved now as a young man. It's crazy that it was 30 that, it took till that time to really find that direction and know what you want. That's really cool.
Yeah, it took a long time. I was in Chicago for 9 years after uni, and trying to figure that out was one of the, things that dominated my thoughts and my whole zeitgeist, if you will. And when it finally happened, it was a miraculous moment, if you will, that I feel very fortunate, because a lot of people never find it, right? And I did, and I pinch myself all the time that I get to do what I do with the people in the industry that I do it in.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy that from the age of about 12, we're asking people what they want to be, and you change so much in that time till you're and the whole time you're trying to figure out who you want to be, and you haven't had much life experience in the world, and no wonder people change degrees multiple times before they figure it out. But
yeah, and what happens, and what I was afraid of, was I was going to get stuck in a place where I was having a family, I was having I had a mortgage, and responsibility would have been bearing down on me that I wouldn't be able to pivot. So I wanted to make that move before that happened, and that's what I did.
And I think that, like you said, that walkabout, or that kind of gap year, or whatever you want to call it, that moment of deferring life to just explore, I mean, I'm sure it depends on where you go, that happen chance you're in Napa. If you were somewhere else, it might have been something different. But that moment of exploration, I think when you take the pressure off and just go and live for a little bit and see the bigger wide world, often is where you find kind of your true calling. So amazing that it kind of fell the way it did. Now, it was quite momentous that you end up studying viticulture at university. Has that made a big impact, that you kind of studied from the ground up in where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, that was a opportunistic decision on my part. So back when I was applying to Davis, the master's program was split into 2 tracks. They've since combined them, but back then you either chose to study enology, which is the science of winemaking, or viticulture, which is the science of growing Vitis vinifera and grapes, and how to learn how to diagnose pathogens and grow grapes and all those things. Anyway, having a biology degree, I knew that I had a lot more of the prereqs done if I went towards the plant biology side, which is viticulture. I knew that I was applying from the University of Illinois, which has an incredible ag program, is what's called a land grant college. The land grant program was something that the U.S. government put into play back in the late 1800s, where they donated vast tracts of land and money for universities that were going to specialize in agriculture. So Illinois was one of those. Even though I was not in the ag program, that reputation of that university carried over to another land grant college, which was UC Davis. So I was like, how do I get into this elite program? How do I make sure that this move I can really grasp onto? And the answer to that for me was path of least resistance, which was the viticulture side. Having no idea that, I wasn't going to be learning winemaking for the first 2 years of my time, that it was just 100% going to be focused on learning about how to grow grapes. And having also that, now reflecting back, realized that without that, I wouldn't be the winemaker who I am today. That the importance of grape growing to the winemaking process and understanding how to create really good grapes to make really good wine is the key to any good winemaker. You can't take lead and turn it into gold. You can take gold and make it into really bright, shiny jewelry. And that's what you learned. And I ended up staying an extra year at Davis, taking all of the enology coursework. And that decision, again, completely opportunistic, but serendipitous in that it has informed my winemaking ever since. And most of how I think about winemaking is through the lens of viticulture.
Yeah, I think that's obvious. Before I knew that, when you speak about wine and when you talk about what you do, so much of it comes down to vineyard. And that was kind of always obvious before I actually read about that. And in your CV, I was like, yes, that makes a lot of sense in the makeup of how you communicate what you do now. Let's fast forward a little bit to the kind of first job that you had straight out of university, and how you ended up coming to Australia. Well,
so I'm somewhat of an anomaly in the wine industry in that my first job is still the job that I carry today. So I worked a number of internships in Napa, and then my last internship was in Italy at Antinori. And I finished that internship, and I had to come back and write my thesis and start looking for a job. And UC Davis has a job fair for the wine industry, and I put myself out there and brought a couple of resumes to this job fair, and one of the tables that I stopped at was the Jackson family table, and I had 2 resumes with me. And one of them I handed to the guy behind the table. I said, can you pass this on for the grower relations position? And grower relations is a position with very large wineries that they have a liaison between the outside growers, the independent growers, and the wine staff. And that grower relations person makes sure that the contracts are being negotiated properly, and then the farming is being done to the spec of the winery that is signing those contracts. So as with a viticulture degree, that is a good starting point for a job, and foot in the door kind of thought process. The other resume I handed to the gentleman behind the table, I said, can you pass this to Marco Di Giulio? Marco at the time was making the Italian varieties that at that moment in California wine history, there were a lot of people pursuing Italian varieties. And I was just back from Italy. I was very interested in keeping that moving forward, that learning of the Italian varieties moving forward. And Marco was doing that at the very highest level. And he was also making a really killer Cabernet called Lokoya. So I hand the resume over to the table, and the guy says, "You're looking for Marco Di Giulio, huh?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "I'm Marco Di Giulio." And I was like, oh my God. And he reads my resume. Now, at that point, I didn't have a lot on my resume because all I had done were internships. So what I had decided to do to beef up what the CV looked like was I listed all of the different varieties of grape that I had made at the various internships that I had done. And in that list was a variety called Teraldigo. And Teraldigo, as you know, is a variety from Trentino that's typically made as a Novello. But around this time, there was a woman who had started to gain a little traction in Trentino called Isabella Foradori. And Isabella was making Teraldigo as a finished wine, as an aged wine. And Marco had just made his first Teraldigo in that same vein that year. And I had made Teraldigo at Antinori because the Antinoris were thinking about doing what Isabella was doing. And he read that I did Teraldigo, and he goes, "You made Teraldigo, huh?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "How'd you do it?" And he came out from behind the table, and we chatted about how I made Teraldigo and how he made it. And he's like, "We're building a new winery in Napa, and I need somebody to help design the lab. Would that be something that you'd be interested in?" And I said, "Yeah, it would be." And he said, "Well, come by on Tuesday, and we'll talk about it." So the next Tuesday, I went to his office, and I walked in, and behind his desk was a poster of the album Giant Steps from John Coltrane. And I said, "You're a Coltrane fan, huh?" He goes, "Yeah." I go, "I just bought a Love Supreme," which is another one of Coltrane's masterpieces. We talked Coltrane for a half hour, and a couple hours later, I had the job. And I haven't left. I've been there ever since.
That is an incredible story.
Yeah, it's again serendipity and opening my mouth at the right time, I guess.
God, and I just think about all the times I was told to go to a job fair, and I was like, nothing ever comes of going to a job fair, does it? And here you are. Yeah,
it was a good moment. Australia. So I've been now. As things have progressed in my career, the Italian variety thing didn't work in California. Those all went away. I ended up working for 3 different winemakers as the assistant winemaker at the winery. Each one of them had a different style that I've ultimately taken on and synergized into my style. They all moved on to different places in their careers, and I took over a number of their brands and helped to start a number of brands along the way, and have gained some bit of success with Cabernet from high altitude vineyards in Napa as my kind of bailiwick of expertise. In 2012, Jackson family, take a step back. In 2001, Jackson family bought Yungara, which is a winery on the flat in McLaren Vale. It is a dialed-in area for Grenache production for Rhone varieties. We hired a guy named Peter Fraser. to make the wine, and Yungara gained, a lot of great accolades, and Pete's an incredible winemaker, and Pete's also the general manager for Jackson Family in South Australia, and he is very connected into the the community of McLaren Vale, and he found out that the Hickinbotham Vineyard was for sale, and that was in 2012. And the Hickinbotham Vineyard being one of the iconic vineyards, not only of the McLaren Vale, but of South Australia. This source for Penfolds Grange, for the Clarendon Hills Australis, for Wira Angeles, for Eileen's, from Hardy's. A lot of great wines have come out of this particular vineyard, and Pete thought that the Jacksons would benefit from acquiring it, which they did. And with that vineyard, about a third of the vineyard was on Bordeaux varieties. And Pete didn't have a lot of experience with Bordeaux varieties, and he and I were mates, and he, proposed to our owner that I might be interested in making those wines. And just timing wise in my career, I was looking for a new challenge. I was looking to learn something new, a new region, and we had talked about me working in Italy, but that's just super difficult working a northern hemisphere harvest, both in Napa and Italy. And so this was an opportunity for me to jump into something that, was a project to help reestablish this vineyard, to help bring back Australia in the U.S., and to learn at the level that, again, all us wine geeks like to learn at. And that's how Hickinbotham began.
Incredible. Peter is a magician, and I'm such a big fan. But I do want to know, I want to talk a little bit about Clarendon and its kind of relation and its specialities, I suppose, in a South Australian kind of wine sense. But tell me a little bit about what your first thoughts were about Australia and about its people when you first arrived here.
Well, I had so I was trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to approach this? I didn't want to be like so many people that come into Napa Valley, particularly French people that come into Napa Valley and, tell us in Napa how to make wine. I wanted to learn as much as I could from as many people as I could in Australia, to learn not only the stylistic choices that are made around Bordeaux varieties, but obviously the terroir and how it separates itself and defines itself relative to what I was most familiar with, which is Napa Valley. So that first year of me coming to McLaren Vale, a lot of what I was doing was tasting wines. The first year, probably 300 to 400 different wines from around Australia. How does Margaret River compared to Coonawarra, compared to the Barossa or Clare or McLaren Vale or the Yarra when it comes to Cabernet? What sets each one of those places apart? So that was a lot of that process. I walked every inch of that vineyard, and the vineyard has, every degree to the sun. It's got slope, it's got contour vines, it's got up and down the hill vines, it's got vines from 1976, from the early aughts, from 2014. It's got a lot of variability. And I wanted to learn that variability. I know Cabernet, so I knew I could grasp on to how to grow really good Cabernet and Merlot. But I didn't know how that vineyard presents itself, right? So the first thing you do is try to figure out what it is that is similar. One of the things that sets Clarendon apart from the rest of the McLaren Vale is its elevation. If you look at most of where McLaren Vale is deriving some of that great Grenache, a lot of that is on the very bottom of the vale, on what I refer to as the flat. And that is a really warm area because it's protected by the hills that surround the vale. And it doesn't, the wind shadow falls way past where all that great Grenache is residing. And so you can grow that kind of variety at a really high level, which is what Pete does at that High Sands vineyard. you start heading towards the northern part of McLaren Vale, and you're starting to head towards the Adelaide Hills GI. In fact, Clarendon is only about 1.5 kilometers from where the Adelaide Hills GI starts. So you get elevation. And when you're getting up to about 1,000 feet, which is where Clarendon is, all that wind, all that cool air coming off the Gulf hits that vineyard, and it hits it in the afternoon, cools the vineyard down, and then it creates this diurnal shift as that flips in the morning time. That's exactly the same kind of effect that we have in the mountains of Napa, and that was something that I grasped onto, and that was why ultimately Cabernet up there does really well, because Cabernet can't reside in the kind of heat that Grenache can. It doesn't do as well. It off-gasses a lot of the flavors, and tannins evolve way too quickly. You lose structure. This was something that I knew, again, trying to find the things that were similar. What I didn't know were the soils. Soils are very, very different. In Napa, our average soil is 60 million years old. It's a combination of sedimentary soils and volcanic soils. In McLaren Vale, in our neck of the McLaren Vale, they're 850 to 900 million year old soils. They're weathered. They're riddled with iron. They don't hold water. They're compact. And I needed to figure out what that meant for growing vines. And this is where I started utilizing the wisdom of the people that were there at a very high level. I was very fortunate, probably 3-4 years before I got there, the region had developed one of the best geologic maps of a region heretofore and since. I don't think there's any other region that has the map that McLaren Vale does. And if you haven't seen it, you should look it up, because it's a brilliant map. What's that? Yeah, so that map was developed by a number of people, including a guy named Philip White. Whitey was a journo that wrote for the Australian for many years, a bon vivant, and just a brilliant man. And he and I became mates, and I picked his brain on that. He was also a geologist. He started as a geologist and moved to journalism. So that he could combine those loves of wine and geology and writing into this map. The other people that I had known, Dudley and Irina from Inkwell. Dudley had shown up with Irina in Napa like 3 years before I landed there, because Irina was writing her doctorate degree and she was interviewing winemakers from around the world. Dudley helped with that map, so I was able to pick his brain. Our vineyard manager, though he didn't help write the map, is a guy named Mick Lane. He had a lot of knowledge from a farming perspective on soils and such. And, gathering the wisdom of those folks and of others that along the way, I started figuring it out. And, obviously then time and experience helps after a few years, and seeing how these vines react in these soils after certain amounts of water with certain nutrient additions or lack thereof, how the vines responded. You asked how I've interacted with the people and my thoughts on Australian viticulture and enology and such. They're some of the most passionate people in the world make wines here, and some of the best farmers, and with the greatest intent on highlighting their respective vineyards and their regions, like many places. We forget about that in the U.S. because the U.S. wine industry for Australian wines was impacted greatly by, by a moment in the history of Australian wines when our markets were being just inundated by really weak wines at the $3 a bottle level, and it changed the perception of Australian wines. A lot of what I do back in the U.S. when I'm talking about Australian wines is touting the incredible place that we grow grapes over here. Whether it's the Yarra or the Hunt Carpenter or Mornington Peninsula or Margaret River or the Great Southern. Every region has something to offer at a very high level, and Americans forget that because, again, the brands that hit our shores for those 10 odd years were not reflective of the quality that actually is being produced here.
Yeah, you put that very well. And it's a question I had for you later on, but seeing we're on the topic, what can wineries do to combat that? Really, to really get to that target market in the US, what do they have to do?
Well, it's a combination of a number of things. The PR, that's a huge part of it. The opportunity to tell the story in whatever venue that they can find to tell the story about Australian wines is key. Road shows. Wine Australia was doing a few of those some years back. Their budgets have been impacted greatly because their budgets are tied into wine sales, which is kind of counterintuitive. So the more wine they're selling, the more they have for their budget, which, you would think the opposite, but it's the way that the wine industry is levied to support Wine Australia, that doesn't happen. But when they were doing that, they would bring in a number of different wine producers and go around the country and show people what those wines could do and how they present themselves relative to California wines or Italian or French or whatever. That is super important. Is tasting people on these wines, getting more coverage, again, from a PR perspective in the publications that are meaningful to Americans, which are The Spectator, The Advocate, The Enthusiast, those kind of places. Halliday, nobody knows who Halliday is anymore over in the U.S. There was a time that Americans were collecting Australian wines, and actually James Halliday wrote the wine Atlas of California, which is, kind of ironic because you think about it now, nobody knows who James Halliday is over there unless they're, at our level, Shanteh, where you're in the industry and what it's about. There's got to be, that kind of awareness on a constant level being developed in the States to bring it back. And then you need companies like ours that are investing and that can go out at the sales level and try to get restaurateurs to create the category. I mean, you go into restaurants in the U.S. and very few of them have an Australian wine category anymore. And when you're a salesperson and you're presenting an Aussie wine, part of the trick is to help that buyer find a place to put that wine on their list, which is, difficult. It's kind of the same thing that I deal with. I make a Merlot at Hickinbotham, and, in the States, you can look at a wine list, and I'm just talking about on-premise now. You can, not retail, but on a wine list, let's say you've got 20 Cabernets. In the States, you might have another category that's Merlot. Maybe there's 10 of them here. Here in Australia, you bring in a Merlot, and I like to think my Merlot's pretty good. There's no category on a wine list for Merlot in Australia. So where does that buyer put that Merlot? How do they present it? Those are some of the challenges that we need to figure out. And
I think it's so great that you brought that up. And again, I want to come full circle about the wines you make at Hickinbotham because, over the time you talked about, your ability to know Cabernet and to make Cabernet, but then with our very old soils and our slightly different climate and geology, learning from the local people. Has your winemaking changed over the course, your first vintage at Hickinbotham to now? Or did you get it right on those first few vintages? I've got the Nest Cabernet Franc in my glass today, and it's such a fascinating wine. I remember the very first time I tried this wine, I've always had a bit of an affinity for the Cabernet and the Cabernet Franc. And it is unlike kind of anything else I probably would say that I see in Australia. So tell me, has the winemaking changed over time?
A little bit. Again, my winemaking is centered around two main factors: growing grapes and then defining place. right? And if I can extract that sense of place by way of the farming, then I've done my job. And then once that grape hits the winery, my further job is to not screw it up by overt winemaking along the way. So those three kind of factors, which is farming, place, and simplicity in the winery, drive all my decision making. Where I have adapted my winemaking is around oak. As a winemaker, you are constantly learning about oak and wine combinations and how to refine those. I've been doing this for 30 some odd years now, and I'm still doing experimentation in Napa on different oak regimes to further dial in that level of nuance that the oak can add to the wines. So when I came over to Australia, I had to use my experience back in Napa as the starting point for the oak and wine combinations that I was going to pursue. And in some cases, they weren't the exact right combinations. And I've learned over the years what those combinations are and how much oak to utilize. That's the other aspect, is that you're trying to preserve certain aspects of the vineyard, but you're trying to frame them. Oak is meant as a framing tool. It's not meant to be the dominant character in the wine. That's meant to either boost the perception or give it a framework. And as the years have gone by, the kind of oak that I've used, and particularly around Coopers, has become much more precise. When I first came here, I had 10 different Coopers that I played around with. Now it's like 5. And I know not exactly, but I have a much better idea as to those combinations and how much oak to give them percentage-wise and time-wise, ultimately then to preserve some of the characters of the vineyard. Now, the Franc that you mentioned, that was a different story. And the Franc has a couple of unique things about it. One, we planted it mostly because I wanted to have blending choices. I wanted to ultimately create, and we talked about this as a team, a 5-variety Bordeaux blend, which is, one of the classic ways of creating complexity in wines, is utilizing Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Malbec, and Petit Verdot in a blend. So in 2014, we planted Franc, Malbec, and Petit Verdot. In 2017 or 2016, we got our first crop, and it was very minuscule amount of fruit that we brought into the winery of that Franc, but it was really good. And it was really good in a right bank way, not in a Loire way. And so the next year, when we got a bigger crop, I proposed to our marketing team that we bottle a Cab Franc in a right bank style for a couple of reasons. One, I had luck with Cab Franc back in California. We make 3 different Cab Francs in California that are quite popular under Lokoya, Mount Brave, and Caledon. So we had some reputation around that variety. The other reason was most of the Cab Francs that I had stumbled on in Australia and particularly in South Australia, were from the Adelaide Hills, and most of them were Loire style. So think about Chinon, like a lot of herbalness, a lot of crunchy tannin, much lighter body, more of a picnic wine versus a wine that you'd age for a very long time. And I saw that as an opportunity. Here we have a vineyard that screams right bank. Why don't we put a bottling together like that? And that's what we did. I've since learned that one of my Davis colleagues, a guy named Bruce Dukes, makes a Cabernet Franc out in Margaret River under the Domaine Naturaliste that is done in the same style. It's a really good wine. I just had some the other day, in fact. So that was why the Franc got put there. Which do you have the 22 in your glass?
Yes.
Yeah, that wine's singing right now. I'm so happy with where that wine is, and that actually is a blend. That has a little bit of, I think it's Malbec and Merlot in it as well.
It's such an enjoyable wine. Period. You could give that to anybody that drinks red wine, and I think that they would enjoy it. It's generous. It's just drinking really well now. It's got really fine tannins. You don't hear me harp on about that, but I could.
One of the things that I try to imbue in all my wines is an energy factor, and in the lineup of the 22s, that wine I think has the most energy of the group, and I'm thrilled every time I taste it to find that again.
Absolutely. I want to know. I mean, I've got a million more questions here, but I suppose I have to let you actually get on with the rest of your life at some stage. But I would like to know because of your history, because you do make wine in various places, and because you're somebody that is very considerate not only of what's happening in a vineyard, your role, but then also who's buying the wines and the legitimacy of where the wines sit. Like you said, in a restaurant scene, you really do think about the whole picture. Australia as a global, on the global stage, what do you really think our strengths are? And is there a variety that you think could rival any of the other wines of the world?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, the strengths are clear. The growing areas that Australia has available from a winemaking standpoint reside in some of the highest levels of quality of any growing area in the world. And part of the problem with Australian wines now in the world is when somebody thinks about Australia, they think it's Australia. They don't break it down as we do here in Australia by the region. You ask the average American wine drinker to name 3 separate regions in Australia, they'll have a really difficult time. They might say the Barossa, but then other region distinctions they would I think falter a little bit. But that's one of the big strengths. The passion of the winemaking community. I mean, that's another strength. And the depth of the scientific knowledge and available research that organizations like the AWRI and Adelaide University put forth. Those rival, in some cases, nobody can rival them, especially around like smoke and fire, bushfire challenges. The Australian science community was way ahead of that when we started dealing with that at the level that we're now dealing with it back in the States. And a lot of the back and forth as we were trying to learn was back to Australia because you guys, or the Aussie industry, had the experience that way. So those things I think are what need to be learned. Those are, that's where organizations like Wine Australia or the individual states or the individual regions that have the opportunity, if they can get the money, to go out and promote those things. In Napa, we have a trade organization called the Napa Valley Vintners Association, and on a regular basis, that Vintners Association is sending groups of winemakers around the world to promote Napa Valley. And there are other regions that do similar things to that within the wine world, but Australia hasn't done that at the level that I think we ought to be doing that. And we should be celebrating this. I mean, that's really important, is that, the belief in the industry and its place in the hierarchy of quality. It should be, as a proud winemaker in Australia, that's something that I'm banging the drum on all the time, and trying to get people to understand.
Well, I do thank you for banging the drum. And I think it's really, I'm being a bit selfish here, but I am asking these questions that I think that people that are tuning in are going to pay a lot of attention to. So I really appreciate you being candid and honest in your answer. I do have to wrap it up. So I do need to ask you, Chris, if you could only drink 3 drinks for the rest of your life, what would they be?
Well, Guinness stout would be number one in that.
Excellent.
Yeah, that is my beverage of choice, no matter what. If champagne, particularly Dom Perignon, I would not hesitate to carry on for the rest of my life. And probably if I was going to, circle all the beverages, a Knob Creek Manhattan on the rocks, no cherry. That would be my last one.
Oh, I love that. I feel like that's very American of you, but Manhattan is right up there for me as a drink. It is just spectacular and ticks all the boxes for something that's so satisfying. So I'm in agreement with you on that. Chris, it's been such a delight. You have such an amazing perspective from all of your life experience, even from 30 onwards. And I'm really glad you joined me today. Thank you very much. And thank you, like I said, for championing Australia, but also for making the beautiful wines that you do in Hickinbotham.
Well, I appreciate that, Shanteh. I appreciate your time and good luck. And I hope to run into you for a glass of wine sometime. Or a Manhattan, for that matter.
Oh, let's definitely make it a Manhattan. Cheers to you, Chris.
All right, cheers. Bye.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram at overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.